Books are the quietest and most constant of friends. They are the most accessible and wisest of counselors and the most patient of teachers. One glance at a book and you hear the voice of another person, perhaps someone dead for 1,000 years. To read is to voyage through time. Good evening, good day, and welcome to all of you participants at this History Hour organized by the Xavier Center of Historical Research, Porvorim, Goa, India. We're very happy to see so many of you participants participating live in this History Hour event. And our resource person today is Mr. Frederick Noronha. More about Mr. Frederick in a while. I now invite our the director of the Xavier Center of Historical Research, Dr. Father Tony Da Silva, to kindly address us for a brief time. Over to you, Father Tony.
Good evening to all of you, and very welcome to this History Hour. We are very happy once again to begin the History Hour. We had interrupted it for a while, and we are happy too that this evening Dr. Frederick Noronha will speak to us. He has, as you know, recently completed his PhD at the Goa University, and his thesis is most fascinating because it deals with the book, the story of the book in Goa. I shall not delve into that because that he will do it himself, but I'm happy to welcome Frederick because Frederick is a good friend of XCHR. He's a benefactor, he's a frequent visitor and supporter. So we are delighted that we can offer him this platform to present his thesis and to present his ideas. The Xavier Center of Historical Research, as most of you know, I think, is a center that has a very, very precious library collection that is available to historians and other scholars so that they too can gain some profit from these old books. And it is all about books this evening, as Father Anderson told us. And so in that context, we are happy that our library is available once again to our subscribers, to our members, and to our friends. The library focuses, for new persons who don't know about this, focuses very much on three areas. There is the Indo-Portuguese history, the history of Goa, and more recently also we have started to strengthen the section on Jesuit history, the history of the Jesuits, because as you know very well, the history of the Jesuits in Goa is quite an ancient history. So it also fascinates many people, many scholars who come here. With these few words, I'd like to welcome once again Frederick and all of you who are attending from different parts of the world. We are very happy that you are able to attend this function put up by the Xavier Center of Historical Research in Goa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Tony, for those introductory words. For those of you who are not familiar with Frederick Noronha, let me give you a brief introduction of our resource person this evening. Frederick Noronha is what I call a network man, especially a network man of Goa. He's been a journalist, a photography enthusiast, an alternative publisher, and a Wikipedian. Between 2013 and 2020, he undertook his doctoral research at the Goa University's Department of English under the guidance of Professor Andre Rafael Fernandes on publishing in 20th century Goa. His viva was conducted last month, at which Professor Abhijit Gupta of Jadavpur University, one of the foremost authorities of book history in India, was the external examiner. The Goa 1556 Alternative Publishing House he set up in 2007 has published about 150 titles during its 13 years of operation. We're very happy today to have Frederick in our midst. I'm sure he is very well known to all of you, and all of you are very eager to hear from him. Just before we begin, just a point to remember, if any of you have any questions, any clarifications, any doubts that you would like to raise with our resource person today, you can type a message in the chat box that you will find on your screens. You can either address it to me or to Frederick. And after Frederick makes his presentation, I will address them to Frederick, who will respond to all of you. Yeah, so I hope we get time for a good interactive session. And yes, Frederick will try his best also to respond to your questions and your queries. So without further ado, let me welcome Frederick. Frederick, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anderson. Thank you, Tony. And welcome to everyone who has taken so much trouble to come from, from different parts, which is made possible only by Zoom. And
yes, it's clear. Go ahead.
Okay,
Frederick.
fine. Yeah. So basically, the presentation is on my PhD thesis, which was done under the guidance of Professor Andre Rafael Fernandez, who is one of the most generous and kindest guides that I could have hoped to find. So I'm really grateful to him. The thesis, the full thesis, available here, courtesy the Goa University, which has been very fast at uploading it, and they always are. So you can just download it from there. And today, this evening, we are going to look at three particular aspects of the thesis. It's not going to cover the full thesis, but I'm trying to give a presentation which looks at the more popular aspects which would be of interest to a non-academic audience. And the first part would look at the context of this topic, and the second part would look at some aspects of the book in Goa and how it's relevant to us and why it's important to study it. And the third part would look at understanding Goa's relevance in this wider point. So to start off, I'd maybe start with a personal note and talk about the time I was a 12-year-old boy and I went to Mapsa, and I visited this bookshop and I tried to get some books on Goa, and there were no books available, not on Goa, children's books in general. There were no books available. This is the 70s, 1975 or so. And then cut to 1990, when I happened to get a scholarship to visit Germany, and I visited Heidelberg, where the print museum is located, very close to where Gutenberg started his printing, actually in the very same town called Mannheim. And I was shocked to read that they had a brochure there which said that the first place where printing was set up in Asia was in Goa in the year 1556. So that has been playing at the back of my mind, and there was a bit of dissonance there. I couldn't bridge these two gaps in reality. On the one hand, there were no books when we were growing up, and on the other hand, this was a center where all the books, the printing of books had started. So how do we actually bridge these two? So, along the way, as some of you who know me would know, I set up this small alternative publishing house called Goa 1556, which is also a tribute to that accidental event. And before that, I started collecting books and reviewing books and things like that. And this is where I've reached today. So the point I want to make is that Goa has played a very early role in spreading not only printing, but also, libraries and education and lithography, as we will talk about. And, we will kind of look at some of these aspects as we go on. It's not that this study is taking on new topics. This issue has been studied. It's been studied quite in depth before. And it's been done by a whole lot of people, right from Aleix Manuel Costa, who's done these 3-4 very interesting, tomes of covering who has written what in Goa, mostly in Portuguese till 1961. And he kind of covers this entire period, about 2,000 authors and about 11,000 books, articles, magazine articles, and things like that, Xavier and Zupanov have also written on it quite recently, Sandra Athaid Lobo, Rochelle Pinto Scholberg, and a whole lot of other scholars. but this is scattered all over the place. It's in different languages. It's not brought together. And I would argue that we don't understand the importance of understanding, print and the history of print in Goa. So sometimes when Goa is written about, because it is so different from the rest of India, it's not in the Anglophone tradition, it's written about in stereotypes. So this is what is said in the Tranquilla Press, which is an imprint of Westland Books, one of the major alternative publishers in India that has since been bought up by Amazon. And they called it a kidnapped victim. They said the first printing press in India was, strictly speaking, a kidnapped victim, because it was supposed to go to Ethiopia. All this is true, but the kind of interpretation of facts is very interesting. So then very often when the history of the press of printing in India is spoken about, they normally talk about the Dutch and Tranquilla, which in its Tamil name is pronounced differently, of course. So in that sense, I think that two things are happening here. One is we are not understanding the importance of Goa in this full print history of not only India, but also Asia. And secondly, because we don't understand it, we don't take it seriously enough. So sometimes it is argued that the 1556 press came here by accident, which is true. And it's also said that it only published religious texts. So in these 2 or 3 sentences, it's dismissed, quite summarily. But that's not true according to me, because while yes, the motivation was to publish religious texts, no denying that, the fact of the matter is that it published a whole lot of other things and very important things, as we will see. So for example, it's you could also say that because I'm a commercial publisher, I do everything for money. Therefore, my other motives are not really relevant to the broader scheme of things. Or you could make an argument that the law of unintended consequences doesn't come into play at all. But this is not true, because sometimes we don't intend certain things, but that's the way it works out. So these early presses in Goa, which were the first Gutenberg presses in Asia. Of course, the Chinese had their own presses before that, but these were not, movable types and of a different sort in the 8th or 9th century. But the first Gutenberg press actually produced a whole lot of other results, which were quite surprising and which we seem to have forgotten over time. So, for instance, the study of languages. Many languages, not just Konkani, not just Marathi, were studied through the press in Goa. The study of plants. So if you go to Panjim, you still can come across the Garcia de Horta garden, recently renamed, which actually kind of pays tribute to a man who had an understanding of early plants in Asia, and his knowledge went back to Europe and it was translated into many languages there. And a whole lot of things happened. Apart from that, there were also kind of strategic information from Asia that went across to Europe and was used by the Dutch, was used by the British, many things. So in that sense, it also had a lot of implications otherwise. Though it is a fact that ideologically also the Portuguese used it for purposes which they thought were suitable for them, like religion and stranglehold over power and things like that. There are studies by young Portuguese scholars who talk about the way Goa played a role, or Garcia de Horta played a role, both in Goa and in Bombay, in constructing and circulating medical and botanical knowledge in Asia in that sense, not just in Goa. And Linschoten is, of course, famous for his study on Goa, on South Asia. He actually came as a assistant to the Archbishop of Goa, turned out into doing some espionage stuff and all that. And actually, along the way, his work got translated very widely into English, German, and a whole lot of other languages. And, actually, as they put it, it's no coincidence that the Dutch maritime expeditions would begin to follow the patterns of overseas Portuguese colonialists immediately after Linschoten's return to the Netherlands. Apart from the direct role that the press in Goa played, it also played an indirect role. So while the Goa was a kind of a hub, it also brought in people like Roth, Heinrich Roth, who who was known by other names in other languages, who was quite a Sanskrit scholar himself. And, these people are very often forgotten about, but if you search for their names and if you stumble across them, you will find that they are actually there and they have played a big role. Pisulerkar, the archivist historian, has argued that the Portuguese language influenced several Indian languages, and he has maintained that Portuguese was a lingua franca in India before the British, before the English came. And he's mentioned the influences that the Portuguese language had in different parts of the country. While we look at the early times, we even forget what happened in the recent past century or two. For example, we look at Goa's history, I think, a little bit simplistically, wherein we don't look at the changes that have happened in a short period of time. So because my study was looking at the 20th century, I was trying to link up the historical changes with the impact it had on the literature creation process, whether fiction or non-fiction. And you find that in the 20th century itself, Goa undergoes a series of changes, like, from being a republican, from being a monarchical state to being republican, secular, going through an anti-clerical phase in the early part of the 20th century. Then Salazar comes in, till 1961. After that too, there have been a series of changes, so pro-nativist and pro-India trends in the middle of the century, together with the influence of Congress and other mainstream parties. And, then you find even from the 80s onwards, politics in Goa, from the 60s, politics in Goa changes drastically, from the MGP, Maharashtravadi Gomantak Party, to the Congress, to the BJP and things like that. So all this does have an influence on the kind of literature that is churned out. If we look back at the start of the 20th century, for example, you find these small bits and pieces of history which are very interesting, and which when you connect them all, it's like a jigsaw puzzle, which kind of creates a bigger picture and helps you to understand what is happening within the Goa context and the wider scenario. So I found it very fascinating, because for me, the book became an excuse to understand the wider historical reality of Goa, and vice versa also, because the history that we encountered and understanding it helped me to understand why certain books came about in that sense. So for example, the first bookshop, I'm sure I might be wrong on some of these things, because the field I chose was so vast and it was really overambitious. So the historians among you, the librarians among you, would definitely be able to point out to some of my errors, and I'll really be happy to accept those. But from what I found was that the first bookshop was set up around 1899, 1900, and it was called Casa Luso Francesca, Francesa, which means the French Portuguese book house. And it was set up with help from Bertrand Bookstore, which incidentally is still running. It's Bertrand features in the Guinness Book of World Records as the longest surviving bookstore in the world, the longest still surviving bookstore in the world. So it's been running for 300 odd years. So, the reason why I'm putting across all these bits and pieces of history, just to build a case of how connected Goa is to the rest of the world, and how to understand Goa, we also need to understand what's happening in the rest of the world. So of course, this is not really dealing with books, but there were about 300 journals which were published in Goa over this 200-300 year period. So Henry Scholberg has done a very kind of interesting listing and classification of these books, of these periodicals. And, he also makes the point that many of them lasted for so long, which suggests that they had a small market, they were fragile and things like that. If we jump across time and come to the late 20th century or middle 20th century, we come across outlets like Tipografia Rangel, the Other India Bookstore, which is like 1980s, 1990s. They were pioneers in the post-61 era, whereas Tipografia Rangel were in the pre-61 era, and they continued publishing till the 80s in a slower kind of pace. And so these things are already written about, and you'll find some references to them in the book. I found Andrew Pereira's work on Typographia Rangel particularly interesting. But as Sandra Athaide Lobo reminds us, a lot more work needs to be done. Today we have forgotten these names, and there are no records available. No one could tell at a glance how many books have been published by Typographia Rangel, or whether they are available. Many of them would have vanished by now and very difficult to find. So the study which I looked on has a chapter which is also focusing on the books published out of Goa. And my argument is that the diaspora has played a huge role in creating this knowledge industry that is so visible for such a small state, and still has so many books flowing out, but of course not enough, always not enough. But they have published all over the world and in different languages. The German radio technologist called Sigrid Pfeffer has come out with a CD in Konkani called Music from Goa Made in Bombay. And while I was doing this work, something that struck me, after meeting people like Sigrid and all, was that our knowledge production for a long time was happening basically out of Goa. So Goa's knowledge production was happening out of Goa in large measure. So we had music coming out from Bombay. We had newspapers coming out from all over the place, starting in Pune and going over to Mumbai and Bombay and, wherever. There were magazines being published, even in Karachi, the Dor Mahine Roti, which is over 100 years old. It's a small religious publication. Its editor has just passed away, Father Vasco Rego, just passed away yesterday evening. And of course, in terms of newspapers, there was the Goan Voice published from East Africa. So, it was easier to get things published in bigger centers where there were Goan populations based, and in places where the industry was much more organized and the infrastructure was available. So to cut this section of the talk to a close, the point I'm making here is that Goan printing and publishing is complex and inadequately understood. We need to study printing presses, publishing houses. There's a lot of work waiting to be done. So I hope that maybe my small efforts will push other young people to actually work on this and to take it on and to somehow complete the story and this jigsaw puzzle which is waiting to be placed in order in that sense. And since quite a few of you are academics here, I'd like to quote Simone Murray, who says that while book publishing and academia seems to share a natural alliance, and the academia should be predisposed to bibliophily, the love of books, in reality we find very few studies happening on the book sector, on the history of the book, on publishing studies and things like that. But it's changing now, as she said. So the second section that we go to is the history of the book. I mean, some nuggets about the book in Goa in particular. If you want the academic version, download the full thesis and read it. It's very boring, it's very dry, but I think it's in simple English. It's not so academic. But here, I'm just trying to whet your appetite with certain kinds of facts and figures. So the first interesting fact is that this is what is going to make XCHR sit down and think, or stand up and think, that Jesuit printing did not start in Rome. So I'm quoting this author called Zuartes, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Jesuit printing, in contrast to the situation in Brazil, the Portuguese Jesuits introduced a local press in India at an early stage so that they could print religious and linguistic works locally. In fact, the history of the Jesuit presses does not start in Rome. but 3 years earlier in India. So please give it a thought. You have a serious responsibility because this is where your printing started. Okay, the second interesting fact is that Goans wrote in at least 18 languages, if not more. So I must acknowledge the work of Professor Peter Nazareth, who is at the University of Iowa, and I came across his book as a young student in the 80s, and borrowed a copy and never returned it and things like that. And I always had this guilt conscience that I need to do something to repay that debt. And finally, of course, we, with the internet, when it came about, we became good friends, and we published a edition of his anthology of Goan writing here and all that. As Augusto Pinto points out, if it was not for Peter Nazareth, we would have not even known that there is something called Goan writing. So when he calculated, Goans had written in 13 languages. So I asked him for a list, and he said, no, I've forgotten it. It's been a long time, and I don't know, what were the languages, and it's been such a long time. So I actually sat down to compile, and I found that there are now about 18, if not maybe 20, because Pali and Russian and things like that are also, sorry, not Pali, it's Burmese and Russian are languages which people, Goans, have been based there, so they probably wrote in these languages. But the others are all documented, so there are names of who has written in which language and where. And we are not even talking about people like Monsignor Delgado, who wrote this famous book called The Influence of Portuguese on Asian Vocables, which talks about 50 languages and things like that. So we're not counting that. So as we were talking about, the comparison between Goa and Tranquebar and all, unfortunately, I think, the Anglophone perspective on research flows down to post 1947 India. So even after independence, we have that mindset. So it's seen as if it's Goa versus Tranquebar, whereas it's nothing of that sort. Goa's history is different and their history is different. But there is a lot of politics in the full publishing sector. And, as someone pointed out, it was the Danish press at Tranquebar was initiated by the King of Denmark, executed by German missionaries, and financially supported by the English. So it's that complex. I think sometimes because of our colonial hangover, we kind of treat everything which has a Portuguese twist a bit negatively. So we don't do justice to the shared history and the part of the history which is common between the two of us. So for example, some of the early books that were published by Portuguese writers in Goa, dealing with Goan knowledge, of course, were very popular in Europe and were reprinted many times there. So there's a full list of the works reprinted and how this shaped up the debate and how other people understood Asia, not just India or South Asia, but the full of Asia through these early works, through the constant reprints. It's a bit boring in terms of details and data, and also I won't go into that, but it's all written and it's all cited. So it's not only in printing, but even in places like lithography, you had people like Zé Maria Gonçalves from Piedade in Divar, who was an early lithographer. He went to Afghanistan under the mission led by Sir Alexander Burns. He died there and was given a dubious distinction rarely accorded to Indians at that time, which was an obituary in the English language papers of Bombay. So I really acknowledge the work put in by Ranganathan, whose article, The Goan Draftsman, kind of alerted me to these things of our history which we were not even aware of. So Ranganathan does this series of essays in a magazine called Print India, which is a kind of commercial magazine, but very interesting. And if you're interested in the field. So there are others who point out that even the early press in Goa itself played a role in promoting or studying the languages of Tamil, Konkani, Bengali, Marathi, and Hindi, if not more, in that sense. Okay, so the point I'm making is that the press is not only a religious press. It's not only looking at botany. It's also looking at languages. It's also looking at strategic information. So it's playing a huge historic role, which is not really understood. Paulo Varela Gomes, who was a very popular delegate of Fundação Orient for 2 terms, had discovered this text called Figueroa's book, which actually, sorry, that's not its name. Its name is in Spanish, which I don't have at the moment. But Figueroa was a Spanish diplomat who was posted in Goa, and he actually wrote this description of Old Goa, which according to Varela Gomes was far better than what anyone else has written. And he was making a case for it to get translated, but unfortunately he passed away and never got down. We never managed to do it. So he was making the point that Old Goa was, not just a Portuguese city, but also an Indian, Italian, French, and Dutch city in that sense. So now to come to the recent times, because this is not just a story about the 16th century, but it's about the 20th century. So you all must have heard about Reginald Fernandes, Damasceno Caridad Fernandes. Okay, these were Konkani writers who used to write the very popular potboilers, if that's the right word, romance as they are called in Konkani. They're just short novels, pulp fiction, if you want to call it that, which was very popular among the masses. They used to come out almost on a, they've written, each of these two guys have written about 100 plus, 100, 200, 300. No one even knows the correct list or the correct figures of how many books they published. And Damasceno Caridad Fernandes used to come out with a novel every Wednesday. Just imagine. It's like, we struggle to come out with an article once a week, but these guys would come out with a book once a week. So that was his speed. But I'm sure many of you, almost all of you, I'm not being arrogant here because I was in the same state myself, would have not heard of Gurunath Naik. And this number is the number of books that he has written, 1,211. And it was just a few weeks back that after I submitted my thesis that I came across one of these books. So again, it's a book in Marathi called Rahasya Katha, which, sorry, the genre is called Rahasya Katha, which means some kind of action thriller or something of that sort. So Gurunath Naik has written 1,211 books, and no one talks about him in Goa. And Luis Dale Menezes has made this point that, these popular writers are not considered as part of the canon and they are not studied academically. And, I think I agree with Dale's point, for whatever reason. Now, these guys, may have not been part of the canon, of the literary canon, or they're not accepted by academia for studies, but it's time that someone did it, because they have shown a torch to all of us. They have a publishing, they are all one-man publishing industries, and they are doing it very effectively in a way that really, kind of puts all of us to shame in that sense. Of course, Jacome Gonçalves, again, from the past centuries, whose writing on Catholic doctrine has become the largest in number, produced in Sinhala and probably Tamil also in Ceylon. What was Ceylon? Just to make the point that, Goa is a meeting point of history, a clashing point of history, whatever you want to call it. So there are at least a dozen PhDs waiting to be followed from all my incomplete threads, which I'm just laying out in front of you and hoping that some of you pick it up. Hemingway was caught up in a plane crash in 1954 in East Africa. And then who goes to rescue him? Of course, it has to be a Goan. So this captain of the launch, M.V. Murchison, probably after Murchison falls and all that, he goes to rescue him. And today there's a Turkish lady whose name I cannot pronounce, I'm sorry, Karayasin or whatever. So she has analyzed the way Hemingway treats the captain of this launch called Edwiges Abreu. very arbitrarily and very unfairly after he actually rescues Hemingway from this plane crash, you know. So those kind of things. Then of course we know Graham Greene visited Goa in the 60s. Dr. Kuto, Maria Aurora Kuto, is probably here, and she has personally met him at that stage. Rushdie has a lot of Goan characters, and okay, the right term would be that he has characters with Goan names. Orlando Costa, whom all of us seem to have forgotten, because he was, he wrote a novel at the wrong time in the wrong language, and he fell through the cracks, as I kind of argue, because it was Salazar's Portugal, and he was a communist, and it was 62, and it was in Portuguese, so it was not accepted in Goa. By some chance, we actually met when he visited Goa in the 1990s, and he sent me this handwritten note where he was complaining about how his novel has been silenced by the by the intelligentsia of Margao and things like that. So that's that. But the story doesn't stop here. It goes on because there are so many interesting tidbits that we need to piece together and get the jigsaw in place. So for example, there's this book called Mumbai Che Varnan, a description of Bombay, and it has been translated recently as Govind Narayan's Mumbai. Now, when I picked up the book at the Central Library, I thought to myself, something told me that there's some Goa connection here. And Govind Narayan Madgaonkar, that's his name, happens to be from Margao, and was settled in Bombay, wrote one of the first descriptions of Bombay, again translated by the Print Week author whom I mentioned above, translated it as a book. Very interesting. Other writers, F.N. Souza, Delgado, I had a fascination with these guys since my college days, and the internet made it possible for me to spam them so much that some of them I actually met. I met F.N. Souza, and he gave me a handwritten note, which I, preserve for posterity in my thesis for whatever it's worth. And it's interesting to know that these guys are part of this small place called Goa, which represents 2 out of 10,000 inhabitants of the planet Earth. But at the same time, it seems to have achieved a lot in terms of history and meeting up with places and all that. Okay, Ansher Lobo is another name which I was intrigued by. I kept seeing his name all over the place, and only recently found out that he was a guy who he's also written books. He's also written books on music, thanks to the work by Aleix Costa. We know all these guys, and we can search who has written what works. At least till 61, there is a well-kept record. So Ansher Lobo has published books on music, but apart from that, he set Sare Jahan Se Acha to music. So the marching tune which you have of Sare Jahan Se Acha is actually set to music by him. Of course, the poem is Iqbal's poem, but he has set the work to music. And incidentally, while on this point, it's totally unrelated to our topic today. The national anthem of Pakistan is supposed to have been set to music by a Goan called Tolentino Fonseca. That's what the Goans dare say. I don't know whether it's correct or not, but I guess they have some reason for saying it. So you have this small community setting the national songs or major patriotic songs on both sides of the border. Quite strange. And then not only that, as we were discussing on the Goa Book Club, Sandra Ataid Lobo came up with this gem to tell us how another Goan called Joachim Xavier Otto de Siqueira Coutinho from Bade in Saloy, that's in Bades, actually saved one of the books of written by Savarkar. So the full debate is documented there. It's on Google Groups, and you can find it of how he saved the work and how it was going to be, it was threatened with being destroyed, and he managed to save it. And so you can find the Goan hand all over the place. So it's very strange and very interesting at the same time. Okay, now Sita Wallace, by now she has become quite a known name in Goa, but when I saw her on the Portuguese Wikipedia, I don't read Portuguese, but thanks to Google Translate, I can convince my friends that I understand a little of it. But when I found Sita Wallace on Portuguese Wikipedia, I said with a name like Sita, she cannot be anything but Indian, maybe Goan, maybe Mangalorean, whatever. And then a full story came out, which I mean, this is not related to the topic of the book today, but she was this radical at 26, a doctor in Angola, who felt that the revolution was not radical enough and they were selling out. So her life story is amazing, you know. So as we will show later, it's not only that Goans have influenced the world of the books, but also you know, they have done things which have made them the subject of books at certain points in time. There are a lot of Tamil Hindi books which we only hear about, which written about Goa, which we don't even have not seen, or maybe don't have copies of. So there's a lot of work waiting to be done and waiting to be, you know, tracked in that sense. This is thanks to Scholberg's you know, bibliography, which tells about all of it. My favorite you know, thesis gone wrong story is about Marathi books, you know. So I was searching for a list of Marathi novels and I couldn't find it, so I depended on my friend Ramdas Kelekar, and he supplied me a list, but I wasn't sure of whether they were there or not there. So when after submitting my thesis just a few weeks back, when I was talking to the librarians at Goa University, they have a beefed up library science department now. And I was talking about, you know, I've included this and I've included that. And they asked me what Marathi books you have mentioned there. So I said, I have very few, you know, I have a problem with that. So one of them, whose name is Mr. Mahamal, told me that he's done this full anthology of every Marathi book that was published in Goa from the start, Arambh Te 2012, from the start till 2012. So it's just a listing, but it's useful nonetheless, because it gives you a good hint into, you know, all the different novels and works, some of which may be hard to find. The last section of the talk before we wind up today is just understanding Goa and linking it to the linking the book to history and linking history to the book. Okay, so I think Ernestine Carrera, you know, makes an important point when she says this was a former capital of empire. So it works in a good way and a bad way. You get the pros and the cons of being a capital of empire, and things happen here. So we need to take it much more seriously and study different aspects of it. The second thing is that, you know, our reality is fast changing. First, maybe we go to this language shifts here, for example. In the 20th century itself, that's my argument, you know, language has shifted many times in Goa. So we have had language shifts from Portuguese till 1961 to a bit of Marathi and English after 61, because of the governments in power, because of a whole lot of other factors. Then we go to more English, then we go to Konkani and Marathi. And again, there is within Konkani, there is a shift from Romi to Devanagari. So you have a lot of language shifts, which really doesn't help the field of studies, because it's a multilingual place and we are treating it as if it's unilingual, and you know, we are not doing justice to understanding the place as a whole. Okay. At the same time, the other point that I found interesting was even Konkani keeps shifting its identity. So it gets called different things by different people at different points of time. So it becomes lingua brahmanica, it becomes Kanari, it becomes, you know, Brahmana, the Goa, it becomes Gomantaki, Goani, Konkani, Amchi Bas. That's what my parents' generation called it. Kokni, you know, Govi, Goinchi Bas at different points of time. So, you know, here again, there is a hint that the way we see ourselves and the way others see us keeps getting shifted and gets changed all along. I feel that, you know, we need to take a slightly more nuanced view towards our past and towards our history. As I'm not a historian, but as I read whatever little I read, I kind of get the feeling that we tend to take simplistic views in Goa sometimes. So we have this view that, you know, Portuguese rule in Goa was like Salazar and Inquisition. Salazar plus Inquisition equals Portuguese rule. But it's much more complex than that, because if you look at things, even the church and the Portuguese state had a very complex relationship, a love-hate relationship. So they keep getting, you know, involved with each other, and they keep getting, you know, into fights with each other. So for example, Alphonse Henriques accepts vassal state status from the Pope in return for papal recognition in the 12th century. Then the church helps the Portuguese state to expel the Moors, quote unquote, from their southern regions. And it was given vast lands as a privilege for the exchange. But then the church's position declines in Portuguese society, and that changes with the overseas empire, and the missionaries become agents of the state, crucial agents of the state. Then in the mid 16th century Inquisition, contrary to the dominant perception of it in Goa, of course, it was not aimed to converting people, but rather to enforce the purity of the Catholic faith. You have a different equation between the church and the state. And then the Marquis de Pombal comes up in the 1750s, 18th century, and expels all the Catholic orders, the Jesuits and the others too later. Okay, and anti-clericalism dominates Portugal even after Pombal's ouster. Then by 1821, the Inquisition gets abolished. So, the church loses its properties, and church-state relations improve after some time. But by 1910 and the First Republic, you have anti-clericalism emerging again. So education gets secularized and all. Then in the 20th century, it swings to the other extreme. We know what happened. But, the point I'm making here is that it's not so simplistic as we would like to believe. Similarly, the issue of language and script, for example, I found this debate about script in Marathi very fascinating because, for example, most of us may not be aware that Modi was the dominant script for Marathi till 150 years back. And then Balbodh came about, which is a variant of Devanagari, and replaced Modi, and the arguments given there and the arguments given here are very similar and parallel and things like that. So we cannot understand Goa in isolation. This is a point again which I must credit to Michael, Shirley's husband, who is a historian and keeps telling me that, Michael Page. The other interesting thing that I also came across while doing all this is a comment from José Machado, who's a Goan in Portugal, and he says that Rome was not built in a day. We all know that, but his argument is that it took longer time to build Goa within its current boundaries than it took to build Rome. So Rome took 176 years, and Goa took 278 years to extend to its current boundaries. So Goa was not built in a day also. To Robert Newman, my good friend, the point that Goans might have among the largest migration levels in the world per capita in the world. So he compares it to Greece, Ireland, Malta, Lebanon, and some of the small Pacific island states. So he says that they have the highest Goa could have, but of course figures are not maintained, so it's very difficult. What my thesis does is to take a table from John Nazareth, who's a statistician, the brother of Peter Nazareth, coincidentally, and he kind of gives figures for the population that could have been at different parts of the world, the Goan population at different points of time. So it's a kind of a statistical guesstimate that he has put out, maximum and what point and what is his confidence level and the date of his estimate and things like that. So, but it's very interesting, and the fact that the migration, that the diaspora has played a big role in influencing the Goan creation of literature, that there is no doubt about. It's very well documented. Okay, and now at the very end, before I run out of time, while we look at migration overseas, there are other forms of migration. There is a migration of Goans to other parts of India, and there is migration within Goa. So if I'm a Goan living in Kankan, and if I live in Panjim or something like that, or if I'm from Bardez and I live in Salsette, that also is migration of a sort. And then, of course, the 20th century power shifts, which we've already mentioned above. So, I've just tried to connect it with some of the fictional works that have come out at different points of time, right from Victor Angel Ribeiro's Tivole, which is set between the world wars, and, religious intolerance and conversions and the difficulty of coping with the change in the 60s when the language changes and the colonial rule changes and things like that. So the interesting thing about approaching the world through the book is that you get all kinds of unusual perspectives which you would otherwise miss. So Anjali Arondekar and her co-author make this interesting point where she says that she questions the understanding of the impact of colonialism on Goa or on all sections of Goans. Now, this might not be a politically correct thing to say, but Arondekar argues that Savarna, meaning upper caste narratives, including historiography, have tended to demonize colonialism even as they seem to have benefited the most from the colonial missionary. And it's also been argued that some of the subaltern caste directly benefited from the patronage of the Portuguese state that provided them with funds to build schools, libraries, and more. So this is something similar to what Ambedkar is saying, that colonialism affects different people differently in that sense. And of course, the argument of why Konkani is not a popular written language till today. It's more complex than the Portuguese destroyed the language. I find that a bit hard to believe. So for example, I make the point here that I've not focused so much on the Portuguese clampdowns on Konkani, that is always brought up very quickly in the debate, but I think it's a set of much more complex factors, including language loss and shaming and all, because we have some of these problems going on till today. It's not that, the problems were only in the past. So like Alito Siqueira argues about shaming by, for different scripts and different dialects of language, or the possibility of language loss, especially in the diaspora, which happens when you're out of the state for 2 or 3 years and you're dealing with a small language for which there are very limited possibilities to learn. These are not alibis or these are not excuses, but I see it as a reality because I've gone through it myself and I've probably tried to recover part of it. But a lot of Indian communities, diasporic communities, are now facing the same problems which Goans faced 1 or 2 generations earlier. Okay, so the positively, the last point before I get the bell. My argument is that politics, economics, and history are much more important than literary talent alone in creating literature. I'm sorry, all my literary friends are not going to forgive me for saying this, but it's a fact. And at least I see it that way. I'm sorry. And if you trace down the correlationship between the great authors of the day, whether they are in England during the height of England's colonial power, or Portugal, during the height of their power, and Camões and things like that, or Spain with Cervantes, and the French authors in the 18th or 19th century when France was a big power, or the United States in the 20th century, and there is a direct correlation. And of course, even before that, the Romans and the Greeks, they didn't come about in a vacuum. They came about during their peak of their empire in that sense. So it's like saying that a language is a dialect with a navy. So if you have military power, you have your literary power as well. So and what we see now is that of course Arabic writers were also popular in their time, 5th or 6th century or whenever, and now we see Indian writing growing and getting recognition worldwide, and I also see it as linked to the economic kind of growth that is happening. Okay, this point I'm sure that Father will not stop me making, because there are just 4 books which I want to talk about that have shaped history in that sense. So Armand de Souza is this guy from Asagaon, who is a young boy, often adopted by his uncle, goes to Ceylon, settles there, and writes his book called 100 Days, Ceylon under Martial Law in 1915, that early. So he becomes the editor and he publishes his book, and the British get really upset with what he's written. And his descendants are still members of parliament, were members of parliament and things like that in Sri Lanka, but totally lost to Goa. We've lost our connection with them. Only you can find them online. The next person is Anthony Mascarenhas, or Neville Anthony Mascarenhas, who's writing in a newspaper, actually, Sunday Times, about the genocide in Bangladesh, was what opened the world's eyes to the Bangladesh issue. And he spirited his family away to London, and then he exposed the story. He was taken there on a tour by the Pakistan Army, but he decided to tell the other side. And he's written a couple of books called The Rape of Bangladesh, which I happened to be able to buy when I had a few taka in my pocket at the airport and didn't know what to do with it. And I found this Rape of Bangladesh and another book also. So his writing, these are books which have actually changed the course of history in a small or big way. Okay, some Goans have had books written about them, so they didn't write the books, but Pio Gama Pinto and Sita Wallace have books written about them because of their role in history. And some books also change the shape of history in Goa today. Like I think Rui Gomez Pereira, Hindu Temples of Goa, does cause a certain amount of disquiet because it focuses on, you know, colonial religious intolerance. And there are other books like also in this category are the, you know, Priolkar's book on the Inquisition, which was published 3 or 4 times, and Mekon, which is a book about you know, caste conflict and caste kind of upsurge in Goa post 61. So that's basically my take on Goa and the book in Goa, and my attempt to understand history through a reading of the books. I like what Martin Page ends with a caution when he tells us that, you know, when the Brits describe Portugal, you got to take it with a pinch of salt. So, you know, I was trying to build up a different kind of perception on how we understand the reality. And yeah, and that's it.
Thanks, Frederick, for that very beautiful presentation. You've given us the history of the book right from the early, from the time the press arrived in Goa, right up to contemporary times. I will not spend time summarizing this talk because most of you were present, very attentive. And if any of you have any questions, do drop a chat in our chat box. There are a couple of questions which I will take directly, Frederick.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, there's this question by Mrs. Kranti Farayash. She says, Mr. Noronha, you refer to Portuguese having had influence on many places in India, but you didn't say what kind of an influence. Would you like to elucidate?
Doctor, if I start, you will I'll trip myself up with my lack of you know, understanding of history, and that is a totally different topic. So I will plead ignorance on the matter. You know, through the book, what I could find is not a complete perception, and I'm sure it's, you know, it's a field which is understudied, but there are some studies on the influence of, say, the Portuguese in Manglo, and you know, even Delgado talks about the influence of the Portuguese language on 50 different Asian languages. And there is this young friend of mine who keeps tracking you know, language in India. I forget his name offhand, but he's on Twitter, and he says that before the English, Portuguese was the lingua franca of the port areas of India, you know, across the country. And then the other point that someone else, I've quoted someone, I can't remember who at this point, someone makes this point that it's not with just a coincidence that the Dutch follow the Portuguese in places like Surat and all that, you know, along the Kerala coast and wherever, and then the British follow the Dutch in that sense. So, you know, all these presidencies of Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, they are built on the foundations that were brought about, you know, through the Portuguese kind of colonial endeavor in that sense. Now the book will give you a limited insight into this, and I'm only looking at history as far as the book gives you a perception on this. I'm not claiming to be or even understand, you know, claiming to understand history in that sense, though it's a fascinating field. Dr. Farias is from Bombay, and she has studied the field herself.
Thanks, Frederick. There's another question directed to you, Frederick. Since tech is cheaper now, okay, this is from Mr. Vincent D'Souza. Since tech is cheaper now, why isn't Goa having its own imprints produced locally? Okay, I think the key word there is locally. And how much has the absence of current printing options in Goa affected the publishing business? What is your
I
take on
know,
this,
yeah,
Frederick?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so Vincent has been in journalism and in publishing himself, so he knows the field better than I do. But my argument is that the small limited size of the market keep your options kind of closed. So if we had a bigger market, then we could have had a bigger publishing sector. But nonetheless, away from my talk, from my what I've been trying to do as a enterprise for the last 10 14 years, I think that every community needs its own voice, needs its own press, needs its own ability to express itself. Talking in a Portuguese context or in a post-Portuguese context, whether it's the Mangalorean community or whether it's the East Indian community, uh, because we are not big enough a market for any major players to take us seriously. So we have to set up our own options. But Vincent, your question is a totally different, is a huge debate in itself. We won't get into that here.
Thanks, Frederick. Maybe one or two questions before we wind up. There's this question to you by Professor Geeta Vishwanath. Her question is, did the printing activity in Goa result in wide readership, which in turn created a community the way Benedict Anderson argued that print capitalism was responsible for nationalism?
Yeah, that is a question that comes up all the time. So, I think we have this European template in mind where the press causes a real revolution there in terms of mindset, in terms of power equation. Whereas here it was a total colonial press. So we don't expect that. That's the first point. I don't think that happened. That didn't happen at all. And there's no glossing over the fact that it was a colonial press. It was a restricted press. It was, even if today the press is an elite instrument, in the past you can imagine how much more it was. And apart from that, as one of these left-wing Brit scholars, I think I'm not sure, I forget his name now. He made the point that till the 20th century, books were not a mass object. Till the 20th century, it's only very recently that we have all this access to. There's a rainforest in my background, which I feel guilty for. But in the past, books were a very kind of elite thing. So in Goa, the role as far as democratizing information was very different from what it played in Europe.
Thanks, Frederick. One last question. This is from cartoonist Angela Ferrao. Her question is, what is your take on the demise of Romi? I think these are Romi Konkani books.
Demise. Okay. That would be a long reply, but I don't think they have really. There's been a demise as yet. Where there is life, there is hope, and there is a certain vibrancy in the market, and the law of unintended consequences comes into play. So the BJP government comes in power and they feel that they need a certain support base there. So they support Delgado and Delgado Konkani Academy. I mean, the guys promoting the Romi script, and that is picking up quite a bit. Though, of course, there are certain things that struck me. For example, now Damasciano Caridad Fernandez's full work is copyright free, because anyone who died before 1960 in India is copyright free. So today this work could have been put out even as ebooks. He was selling 200 or 300 different titles at different points of time. So someone has to take the leadership and do it, And unfortunately, as your Jesuits would say, the vineyard is rich, but the laborers are few, or what is it? Something of that sort, no?
Frederick, that's in the Bible, the book.
Okay, I'm getting it wrong.
Thanks. One last question from Adela. Adela, can you give us a general idea if during your study you came across the relations between books and periodical press, and whether they shared editors and writers? Whether yeah.
Actually, I've not gone so deep into it. There are entire theses done on the printing press in Goa. On the periodical press in Goa, newspapers and periodical press, including by Dr. Rekha Mishra. So she has done her full thing. What I did note was that at a certain point of time, there were print houses which were linked to newspapers. So like, they'd say the press of O Herald was publishing books. So it was obvious that, they would make use of these printing presses to publish books. Now, in some cases, yes, it was a small group of people doing the same work. Like, so you find the same name like Antonio Maria Cunha and things like that coming up again and again. So they were involved in all sides of the field because it's such a small sector, I guess. But that would require much more work. What also requires much more work is the different languages, because I've done too much of a generalist kind of overview of it all, and maybe detailed study of the publishing houses, the printing houses that operated.
Thanks, Frederick, for that beautiful talk, beautiful responses to the queries, and that excellent clarification. I think we've come to the end of this 1 hour's Histria. Excellent knowledge, Frederick. I mean, you've delved into the subject, which is so vast, and I think you've done enough justice to the small topics that you exposed today for us. For those of you who joined in a little late, this talk will be available on YouTube. Kindly, when you go to YouTube, just look at the Xavier Center of Historical Research channel, subscribe to it. You will find also the previous talks that were done online. All of them are available on our YouTube channel. So it was nice having all of you present at this Histria. Have a good day. Good evening to all of you in India. To those of you in the West, have a good day. Just beginning your day. And I think someone from Australia, good night to you. Yeah, we'll see you the next time.
Thank you so much.